everybody, and welcome. I am Nate Price, one of the organized play community managers at Wizards of the Coast. And I'm here sitting with Ben Stark and Rich Hagan, and we're going to talk to you today about the format you're going to be spending the next 4 rounds of today watching with us, and that's Team Unified Standard. Now, Team Unified Standard is a bit different than most of the standard formats you're used to seeing. I talked with Ben a little bit about this earlier, but it's very similar and very akin to building a sealed deck, for example. Before we dive into kind of the finer points of this, let's take a quick look at the rules of construction for a Team Unified Standard deck list. So what you need to do is each team is given the entire set, a play set of the cards in Standard. They have to construct standard legal decks, and no team or no deck is able to contain more than 4 copies of any card. There have to be a maximum of the 4 cards across all the deck lists, which means between your 3 decks you get 4 Abzan, 4 of the Siege Rhinos, you get 4 of the other big cards in the format right now. And let's take a look actually at what makes Unified Standard tick.
Okay.
So to look at Unified Standard, one of the big things is it is a wedge-driven format. There are the 5 different clans, and each one is represented by a very powerful 3-color card. I know, Ben, you've had a little bit of success in your time with one of them in particular. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, I immediately took to Jeskai. You know, in our testing before Pro Tour KTK, we played a little with Abzan. I didn't really like the deck very much. It kind of, it's a good deck, obviously. It's probably the deck to beat, but it felt like it had a little bit of a problem with flooding out sometimes. Whereas Jeskai was perfect for me. I kind of felt like it played a lot of really close games, and I felt like the deck had a lot of different angles. Like, what I really liked was sometimes with that deck, you make a lot of trades, you play really defensively, and then you go for dig through time to win you the game. Other times you play really aggressively, even suiciding guys to get in damage, so then you can burn them out with Stoke the Flames or Jeskai Charm. So the deck is very skill rewarding, very skill intensive, and very grindy. You see so many games with that deck where it comes down to 1 damage, Xaxes, 2 damage, using your spells the right way. It's definitely a deck that, if you consider yourself, a very experienced Magic player and you can practice a lot, it's a deck that you can reap a lot of rewards from.
So this sounds to me like this is exactly the deck that if we were a team, I should not be going anywhere near. You should be playing it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously every deck is hard, but it's a bit more challenging to decide whether you're going to play defensive or offensive every single game, because the deck is very flexible and capable of each, whereas you have more defined roles with some of the other standard decks, such as Abzan or Sidisi Whip, even Mardu. Timur, I feel like, kind of goes either way, very similar to the Jeskai deck.
So one of the things I'm sure Rich can attest to is over the past set of months, as we've seen the new standard unfold, the overwhelming majority of the highly successful decks that we've seen have happened to be centered around these clans and these wedges. You see the Jeskai deck we were just speaking of. You see the Pro Tour winning deck Ari Lax had playing Siege Rhino in Abzan. It's kind of driven by this desire to play these powerful 3-color cards.
Yeah, sometimes you see that the message coming out of Inside Wizards about this is what the set's about. Sometimes that's willfully misleading because we want to hide some of the fun stuff that's there, and you want people to gradually discover the cool stuff for themselves. But especially with gold sets, if you are playing away from the wedge and you are not trying to be out but you're like, I want to play my allied color pair that ignores all the synergies and all the gold, that's super hard to do. And this really is a format where you are rewarded for following down the lines that the set sets out for you.
Exactly. And the difficult thing with working with wedges is the fact that there are so many points of overlap. We've got multiple wedges, and each one has got 2 colors that it's going to share with another one of the wedges. For example, you've got Abzan at green, white, and black, and Mardu, which is also black and white centers. So the ability to play and the desire to push yourself towards playing one of these 3-colored cards leads to the point where you have certain wedges that you can play with and you cannot play with. For example, it's very difficult to play cards like in Mardu midrange, as well as playing some of the Jeskai cards, because they are aggressive cards that want you to go forward with those cards overlapping in the same decks. But the big issue really comes down, you're not going to be able to play 2 Mardu decks next to each other, 2 Abzan decks next to each other. The point of contention really becomes the single-colored cards that kind of fill the cracks between the clans you decide you want to play. Let's take a look actually at some of the really contentious single-colored cards and some of the lands that are really the sticking points in this format.
All right, so there we are. We've got green, red, white, black, and lands sitting over there. Now, the green cards, I bet if ever there was a comedy double act in a format, has anyone ever played one of those without the other intentionally? I mean, they are just one of the great historic duos.
I think the only example I can think of really is if you're looking at, say, Mike Sigrist's Pro Tour Khans of Tarkir deck, that Obzon aggro deck. A lot of times you'll see that deck running the running the coursers, but not running the caryatids because it's just not as good to be spending your 2 mana doing that as playing something like a Rakshasa Death Dealer. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. They're basically the Wonder Twins of this format, and like if you're playing green, you're playing those 2 cards. Red is another really, really contentious color, and it's in part due to the fact that one of the cards that we were talking about going into Pro Tour Khans of Tarkir is one of the big cards of the format was Goblin Rabblemaster. Ben, you've got a bit of history playing Rabblemaster, don't you?
Yeah, I played it in that Pro Tour. It was fantastic. It's one of the most powerful cards in the deck. You're certainly not going to cut them. I mean, I couldn't imagine playing the Jeskai deck without the Goblin Rabble-Masters. That just wouldn't really make any sense.
But it's not even just the Jeskai deck that plays them, and that's the big problem. Every deck that's playing red and has a medium level of creatures or is going for the aggro bench is going to want to play that very, very powerful 3-drop creature.
You need him for Mardu as well. Any sort of mono red. I mean, he is just a staple of red in this format.
Another of the really difficult to split cards is Lightning Strike, actually, and a big part of that is no matter what style of deck you want to play, if you're playing red, Lightning Strike does what you want it to do. It finishes for the aggro decks, it takes control for those control decks, and does basically everything for those mid-range decks that you see. Yeah,
it seems like when the cards are single color like that, then the decks both want them, and therefore the decks get weakened a lot if you try and split them. Whereas there's some other cards that are specifically for their wedges. Like blue doesn't seem to offer a ton of single color cards, so it seems like maybe blue is a little bit more splittable than red, let's say, in terms of Team Unified Standard.
Okay. So you've mentioned Goblin Rabblemaster and Lightning Strike. Why don't we look at some white cards that are going to be contentious, if you will. And one of them, which on the face of it seems unusual that there would be an issue over, is this innocuous little 2/2, sort of, Seeker of the Way.
I don't know if I've seen as powerful or format warping and uncommon as that is. It fits into basically everything that you want to be playing if you're playing creatures in white, right?
He's excellent. Just because a card costs 2 mana does not make it innocuous. He is just incredibly powerful. I mean, you see even Yuya Watanabe's deck from Worlds, it's not really an aggro deck. It still plays Seeker. I mean, that guy is just, if you're white and you're not like a Wrath of God deck, you're playing Seeker.
Yeah, I mean, it's in blue-white heroic. You get to see it in like the Jeskai heroic deck, as we just talked about that Watanabe is playing. You also, it's just in traditional Jeskai beatdown decks. It's in Mardu mid-range, Mardu aggro. It's just in everything where you want to deal damage to your opponent. The other big one is actually, it's Wingmate Rock, and this is kind of the top end for a lot of these mid-range decks. It hits 5, drops that, and it's almost invariably 6 power of creatures with a nifty little side effect for only 5 mana. I mean, you're going to see that card basically in, like, it's an Obzon mid-range, it's in Mardu mid-range, Mardu tokens. The white card is another really contentious point. You mentioned that blue isn't particularly contentious, but black definitely has some points of contention. Why don't you elaborate a little bit on that for us?
Well, I mean, black has some staples too, and while you don't necessarily have to have 4 of them, like Corsair and Caryatid, you do want to play these black cards in virtually all your black decks. Thoughtseize and Hero's Downfall. Now, the nice thing is that you can maybe split the downfalls. I mean, you want 4 between your main and sideboard. You see almost all the black decks in Standard play 4 Hero's Downfalls between their main and sideboard. But it's not the kind of card that you have to have 4 of. So I think in the Team Unified Standard, you'll see black be split by several teams, and you'll see most likely both decks will just have 2 Hero's Downfall each.
Wow, that sounds super scary. I mean, what I thought you just said there is that everyone wants 4, so we're going to give 2 people 2 each.
Right. Well, it's a card that you like to have 4 of because it's a good card, but it's not the kind of card that makes the rest of your deck tick.
Okay, sure. So it's certainly not an engine card, it's not the defining card, it's not all the synergies. In fact, it isn't synergistic.
Right, exactly.
It's just reach out, get rid of that.
It's a strong card, but it's not a necessity.
Got you. Understood.
All right. Possibly the most overlooked and underrated difficult cards in Unified Standard are the mana base. It's the lands. We have access to a whole variety of pain lands, access to a variety of temples, a variety of those new gain lands. But there are correct ways and incorrect ways to build mana bases, and those are the big sticking points behind what makes Unified Standard tick. Looking at the number of tap lands you see in exec, for example, you've got most decks that tend to play about 6 or 7, right? So this is actually one of those things that relates very well to Limited, where you've got a certain number of powerful cards you need to cram into the deck, but you've got to make sure that your deck can actually support them. If you don't have the mana, your deck doesn't run.
Right, you've got to have enough mana sources. I think in this Team Unified Standard, you will see some people playing Gain lands instead of Scry lands, and obviously the Scry lands are better. In Standard, you're almost never going to see a deck play a single Gain land until it's maxed out on Scry lands. But I don't think that's a major sacrifice. I think that's a minor sacrifice. The problem is when you have to start cutting pain lands for gain lands, because as you just said, the sweet spot as far as comes to play tap lands is usually around 6 or 7, so you draw 1 and then you can play it on turn 1 when you're probably not doing anything. If you draw 2 in your opening hand, it can become a big problem in Standard. You can't just put your lands into play tapped every turn. You want to hit your curve. So if people have to remove pain lands to share those and then try to replace those with game lands, they could end up with 8, 9, 10 comes into play tap lands, and that's really going to hurt your Standard deck.
So what you're telling me is if you want to make sure that you're able to keep the quality of your deck high and don't want to mess with your mana base, no pain, no gain, right?
Yeah, I mean...
Wow. Wow, I thought I was sitting in that chair as well.
How did you miss that?
Yeah, sorry.
So we've been talking about all of the different things that make it difficult to build these decks. Let's take a look at actually some of the incompatible deck lists, ways that you can't actually build decks if you're attempting to do the right thing in Unified Standard. The first two that we've got are Mardu Midrange and Jeskai. As you can see, the highlighted cards on this list, the Hordling Outburst, the Seeker of the Way, the Goblin Rabble Master, Lightning Strike, Battlefield Forge, and Temple of Triumph. These are cards that are shared for both of these decks. It's virtually impossible, because they make up such a large percentage of these decks, to keep one of these decks and not significantly hamper the other one. How do you combat something like this if you're going to be attempting to look at a deck to build?
I don't think you can play those two decks. I think that those decks are incompatible. You have to look for the decks that are compatible.
Okay.
Some of the clans, are compatible with each other. Like you highlighted earlier, Abzan Aggro goes really nicely with Jeskai.
Okay.
There's virtually no overlap between, say, Sidisi Whip and Jeskai.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can play Mardu and Jeskai.
All right. We mentioned some of the green cards earlier as well that make it very, very difficult to split that color up. Another really good example of an incompatible pair of decks would be to look at, say, for example, Abzan Midrange, which is a terribly popular deck. It's Ari Lax's Pro Tour winning deck. And then Sidisi Whip, which we saw just absolutely rampant throughout the World Championship the other day.
Yeah, you cannot play those two decks.
Let's take a look and see what the overlap between those two decks is, actually. We know that there's going to be the overlap between the Courser and the Caryatids. But if you notice, the lips between Abzan Midrange and Sidisi Whip, we also get those removal spells that you're talking about. They both want those Heroes' Downfalls. They both want those Thought Seizers, and then they've also got the lands that are kind of an issue. So, knowing that we can't actually play these decks, do you have any good suggestions, you said, for compatible deck lists? I know that you mentioned Abzan Aggro and Jeskai. Well, what other options do you have for us?
Well, Mono Red Cruise, that deck doesn't really pull from very much at all. So I think that can go well with, say, Blue White Heroic and Sidisi Whip.
Okay. So let's say you want to actually stay on, you want to play those really powerful clan-based, wedge-based cards. Like, you want to play those heavy hitters like your Lightning, your
Jeskai?
Yeah, with the Mantis Rider, thank you. You want to play those Mantis Riders, you want to play, don't laugh at me. You want to play those Mantis Riders, you want to play your Siege Rhinos. Let's put those into deck lists that are actually compatible. Let's take a look at our first set of compatible deck lists.
Now, when we say compatible, we're basically saying, legal. Because compatible isn't a synonym for awesome, it's just a synonym for allowable.
It's actually very important to note, Rich made this good point earlier, this is a format where the decks you're going to see aren't going to necessarily be the same decks you see running rampant over the tops of a tournament. I mean, most of the deck lists we've shown you are actually pulled straight from the top 8 of Grand Prix San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
This Abzan list that we've got right here is a representative of roughly the same deck that Mike Sigrist ran at PT KTK.
Right.
So we are showing you versions of these decks that can run well with each other, but they are going to be usually slightly subpar because you've got to make these allowances for the fact that you have to split this format up so that you have only 4 cards of any given type across your 3 decks.
Right. I think what's really important for people to understand when they're actually watching the matches this afternoon is if you are watching an entire deck in action and your question watching it is, why would you play that? And the answer is usually because they determined they couldn't play anything else.
Yes. Those two, it gets back to our incompatible deck list. You
Right.
are playing this deck because the other 2 don't work out. To go along with that Abzan aggro list that we just looked at, if we're going to take the green, black, and white aggressive cards, one of the things we can do, surprisingly, actually, since it's primarily green and black, is put Jeskai together with that. Because
like
Jeskai picks up a lot of the blue and white side of that with the red for removal, and red doesn't have another home. So let's take a look at a Jeskai list that fits actually just alongside that Abzan aggro list.
Okay, so we're now getting just some of the white and basically moving to blue and red. So here's Jeskai. That was the Abzan aggro deck. Let's take a look at deck B then. Here's Jeskai.
So, as we guys said, Jeskai's got a lot of those cards. You had to split up the Wingmate rocks between the 2 lists, but because of the fact that we're not running another red deck, you just have free reign to put in cards like Goblin Rabblemaster, Mantis Rider, the Seeker of the Ways. Surprisingly, actually, all in this deck, you don't have any of those in the Abzan deck due to the color restrictions. So we've gone through most of our aggressive cards. So if we want to put some other deck together with this, we have to kind of think outside the box. And our best option for thinking outside the box, at least that I can think of, would be something like a control deck or a combo deck.
Sure. I mean, Jeskai Ascendancy, it's a cool deck. It might be just outside of Tier 1, but it's certainly playable, and it doesn't use like any of the cards that these other decks use.
All right, let's take a look at a Jeskai Ascendancy list that could be compatible with the other 2 decks. You put this Jeskai Ascendancy deck together, and you notice that the Sylvan Caryatids that were notably absent from our Abzan aggro deck are now here with a home in this Jeskai Ascendancy deck. And this is a deck that we've seen do well. I mean, it just made top 8 at Pro Tour Contentious here, right?
See, that was allegedly a bit of an outlier. Jeskai Ascendancy, I really think it's one of the most curious decks we've seen across Magic, not just in Standard, for a long, long time. Because it's so obviously it's already got a bullet on it because it's a deck that is also a card. So it's just, it has a name and here is the card, and people were terrified of it in Modern. Then it didn't do anything in Modern. Then suddenly at the World Championship, it was super good. In Standard, it made the top 8 of a Pro Tour, but then people went, don't know how it made the top 8 of a Pro Tour because it's not very good. And now here we are again going, well, maybe if we have to play it, we can play it, but maybe someone's going to go, yeah, and the reason we're playing it's actually excellent. So it's so rare that you get a time where an archetype is not finally nailed down by the world. But I feel that Jeskai Ascendancy still leads the community in where we're meant to put it.
And ironically, one of the big selling points about this format, and specifically Jeskai Ascendancy within this format, is these pools lead you to play decks that are generally just a touch weaker than the optimal version of a deck. So a deck that is just on the outside, one of those outliers, like you said Jeskai Ascendancy was, this is an opportunity for it to be comparatively better than it would have been in a normal circumstance because it's up against potentially slightly weaker decks. If you don't want to go with the big clan and wedge strategy, you actually have another completely open option to you. We've seen the rise of a large number of non-clan based decks recently, most notably the blue-white heroic deck that made top 8 at Grand Prix San Antonio. It's a very, very powerful deck featuring a lot of the aggressive blue and white cards, but it's got misses all of the red cards that make Jeskai what it is. So you could possibly do a trio of decks that don't use any color overlap whatsoever.
Wow, okay. Why don't we take a look at those then? So what are we going to start out with?
I believe we're going to start out with the mono-red Treasure Cruise deck that we saw make the top 8 of Grand Prix San Antonio.
Okay, so there we are. A couple of Sarkhan up the front, Treasure Cruise. Yep, all I mean, this is utterly uncompromising. This is exactly what you want to be playing.
Yeah. Another deck that, you know, might be slightly behind Obzon and Jeskai, but certainly playable.
So to go along with this, I think the perfect companion to this, since we got red covered, let's cover white and blue and move on to our blue-white heroic list. Now this is a deck that you've seen do incredible work. I think Tom Ross was playing this deck for a while and showing some great results with it as well. It's kind of what drew me to the deck in the first place. And then seeing it go nuts at San Antonio was another one of those things that kind of put it into my forefront. This is a real deck.
Yeah, last week in San Antonio, Ori Swift, I believe his name was, who got second place, you know, he worked directly with Tom Ross, and then they basically tested together and played the same list, I believe. So, you know, their list took second place in the Grand Prix last week.
Yeah. So we've covered red, we've covered blue-white. That leaves us with green and black. And there are a couple of options for you. You've got green-black Constellation decks, but the big story and the big breakout for us at the World Championship this year was Sidisi Whip, which is a mostly green and black deck. Playing only a few blue cards in the Sidisi and maybe a Sagumaler here. This list is specifically the list played by Albert Ick from Grand Prix San Antonio. So we see that we're able to use no color overlap and get the exact same thing. So this is basically the kind of problem that the teams are going to have to solve. They've got very important cards, very powerful cards, a lot of color overlap, a format that pushes you to want to play color combinations that have overlap. It's a tough puzzle to solve.
And then, who plays what, in what seat, with the captain where, with the coach where, against who? What do you expect in the metagame? If you know everyone's on blue-white heroic, what do you do about it? If you know everyone's on mono-red, do you start for Drown in Sorrow in your blue-black control list?
It's a never-ending puzzle, and it's one of the reasons I actually really love this format and looking incredibly forward to seeing what the players here at the World Magic Cup have come up with.
I tell you what, Nate, you're a community manager.
I am.
How about we throw it to the viewers at home? Why don't you tweet us your answer, give us your 3 decks for this afternoon? If you were going to put your 3 unified standard lists together, what would those 3 archetypes be? Use the hashtag MTGWMC, and we'll do a little Twitter feature at the end of this first round, seeing what the viewers at home came up with.
Sounds absolutely perfect. I'd be very interested to see not only what they come up with, but see how many of you guys got the winning lists correct.
All right, so there we are, and that was Team Unified Standard.